A flight attendant takes a drastic measure by kicking off a young black boy from her flight, only minutes before discovering a truth that turns her world upside down. Who is this boy, and why is his story so important that she's now begging for mercy? This flight is about to uncover secrets that will change lives forever. What led her to such a quick decision, and what will happen when the full story comes to light? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Jamal stood at the boarding gate, his fingers wrapped tightly around the frayed straps of his small backpack. The worn fabric matched his threadbare t-shirt and jeans that were a size too big, held up by a belt with extra holes punched through it. Around him, business travelers in crisp suits and families in vacation clothes formed neat lines, their wheeled suitcases gleaming under the airport lights. His heart thumped against his chest as he watched the gate agent scan ticket after ticket. The piece of paper in his hand felt delicate, like it might tear from how hard he was gripping it. He'd never been on a plane before, never even been inside an airport until today. "Next, please," the gate agent called out. Jamal shuffled forward, his worn sneakers barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. He held out his ticket with trembling fingers. "Are you traveling alone, young man?" the agent asked, her eyebrows raised as she scanned his boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am," Jamal replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. As he walked down the jet bridge, the rumble of the airplane engines grew louder. The sound made his stomach twist into knots. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant greeted him with a practiced smile that faltered slightly as she took in his appearance. Inside the plane, Jamal felt like every eye was on him. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, lined with curious faces that quickly turned away when he caught their gaze. A businessman in a dark suit pulled his briefcase closer as Jamal passed. A woman in pearls whispered something to her husband, their eyes following his progress down the aisle. "Let me help you find your seat," a flight attendant offered, noticing his confusion as he studied the row numbers. Jamal nodded gratefully, following her lead until they reached his assigned spot. The seat number matched his ticket, 14A, but he hesitated, unsure of the proper way to sit down or what to do with his backpack. "The overhead bin or under the seat in front of you," the flight attendant explained kindly, gesturing to his bag. Jamal chose to keep the backpack at his feet, tucking it carefully under the seat. He slid into his place by the window, trying to make himself as small as possible. The leather seat felt enormous around his thin frame. "Did you see his clothes?" a woman behind him whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Where are his parents?" another voice murmured. Jamal stared out the window, his reflection in the glass showing cheeks that burned red with embarrassment. He pulled his legs up closer to his chest, wishing he could disappear into the seat as more passengers filed past, their curious glances and whispered comments making him feel more and more out of place. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and Jamal fumbled with the buckle, watching out of the corner of his eye how others did it. The metal clicked together after a few tries, and he let out a shaky breath. Around him, the murmur of conversations continued, punctuated by occasional glances in his direction as the plane prepared for takeoff. The cabin's air felt thick and warm as more passengers filed in. Jamal's throat was dry from nervousness, and he spotted a flight attendant with a drink cart nearby. Gathering his courage, he raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me," he called out softly. "Could I please have some water?" Linda, the flight attendant with carefully styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform, turned toward him. Her professional smile wavered slightly as she took in his appearance. "Of course," she said, reaching for a plastic cup. As she handed him the water, Jamal's fingers trembled. The cup tilted, and before he could steady it, cold water splashed across his lap and onto the businessman seated next to him. The man jumped up with a startled yelp. "My suit!" the businessman exclaimed, brushing at the wet spots on his expensive-looking pants. "This is Italian wool." "I'm sorry," Jamal's voice cracked as he grabbed for the napkins Linda quickly offered. "I didn't mean to—" "Here, let me help," Linda said. Her tone clipped as she handed more napkins to the businessman. Red-faced and flustered, Jamal remembered his backpack was still partly blocking the aisle. He should put it up in the overhead bin like the other passengers had done. Standing up quickly, he reached for his bag, but his wet hands made the worn straps slippery. As he lifted the backpack over his head, it slipped from his grasp. The bag tumbled down, striking a woman in an aisle seat directly on her shoulder. "Ow!" she cried out, rubbing her shoulder. "What in the world?" "I'm so sorry." Jamal's words tumbled out in a panic. His hands shook as he tried to retrieve his bag from where it had fallen. The businessman next to him was still dabbing at his wet pants, muttering under his breath about dry cleaning costs. The woman in the aisle seat glared while massaging her shoulder. Other passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, their disapproving murmurs adding to Jamal's distress. Linda stepped forward, her expression now a mixture of concern and suspicion. Her blue eyes narrowed as she surveyed the scene. The wet passenger, the injured woman, and Jamal standing there with his backpack clutched to his chest, looking more out of place than ever. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that made Jamal's stomach clench. "I think we need to have a conversation about proper airplane behavior." Linda positioned herself in the aisle next to Jamal's seat, her presence commanding attention from nearby passengers. Jamal sank deeper into his seat, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. "Can you explain to me what's going on here?" Linda asked, keeping her voice professionally calm but firm. "First the water incident, and now dropping bags on other passengers?" Jamal's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I didn't..." His words came out in broken fragments. "The cup was... my hands were..." Linda's eyes narrowed as she observed his behavior. The boy's hands were twisting the hem of his worn t-shirt, and his eyes darted between her face and the floor. "Where are your parents?" she asked, glancing around the cabin. "Are you traveling alone?" Yes, Jamal stammered. "I mean alone, no parents." A couple across the aisle exchanged worried glances. The businessman, who had been splashed with water, was still dabbing at his pants with tissues, shaking his head disapprovingly. "Do you have any documentation, your boarding pass?" Linda pressed, her training kicking in. Something wasn't adding up. Jamal fumbled in his pockets, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the crumpled paper twice before managing to hand it to her. "Here," he whispered. "And who arranged this flight for you?" Linda continued, studying the boarding pass carefully. The... Jamal's voice trembled. He took a deep breath and tried again, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Behind Linda, passengers were whispering among themselves. "Poor thing looks terrified," an elderly woman murmured to her seatmate. "Something's not right," another passenger responded. "That boy shouldn't be traveling alone," a man in a business suit said loudly enough for others to hear. "He's clearly not prepared for it." Linda watched as Jamal's face flushed red with embarrassment at the comments. His inability to provide clear answers and his obvious distress were raising red flags in her mind. Years of training had taught her to trust her instincts when something felt off. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, giving Jamal what she hoped was a reassuring smile, though her concern was evident in her eyes. Moving to the front of the cabin, Linda picked up the crew phone. She dialed the ground staff's extension, turning slightly away from the passengers, but keeping Jamal in her peripheral vision. "This is Linda from Flight 2317, she spoke quietly into the receiver. "I have a situation with an unaccompanied minor in seat 14C. He's showing signs of severe anxiety, causing disruptions, and unable to properly communicate about his travel arrangements. I have serious concerns about his ability to complete this flight safely on his own. Could you please check his documentation and advise?" Linda held the crew phone close to her ear, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "Yes, he seems extremely anxious. There have been multiple incidents already. Spilling water, dropping luggage on other passengers. He can barely string together a coherent sentence when questioned." On the other end of the line, the ground staff member asked several questions about Jamal's behavior and documentation. Linda glanced back at the young boy, who sat rigid in his seat, his eyes fixed on his lap. "No, I haven't been able to get clear answers about who arranged his travel," Linda continued. "Given his state of distress and the disruptions he's caused, I'm concerned about his ability to handle a long flight. A businessman who had been listening nearby leaned forward. "If you ask me," he said in a low voice, "having him on board is a liability. He's clearly not in any state to travel." An elderly couple nodded in agreement. "The poor dear seems completely overwhelmed," the woman whispered. "It wouldn't be right to let him fly like this." After a few more minutes of discussion with ground staff, Linda made her decision. She walked back to Jamal's seat, her expression professionally composed but firm. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice gentle but authoritative, "but I'm afraid we can't allow you to continue on this flight. We need to be certain that all our passengers can travel safely, and right now, you seem too distressed to make this journey." Jamal's eyes widened with fear. But I have to go," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please gather your belongings," Linda instructed, gesturing to his worn backpack. "Someone from the airport staff will escort you back to the terminal, where they can properly assess your situation." Jamal's hands trembled as he reached for his backpack. Other passengers watched in silence as he slowly stood up, his movements uncertain and hesitant. A member of the airport staff appeared at the aircraft door, having been summoned by the ground team. Linda gestured toward Jamal, who looked smaller than ever as he shuffled down the aisle, his backpack clutched tightly to his chest. "This way, please," the staff member said, extending a hand toward the exit. Jamal paused at the threshold of the aircraft door, looking back once at the cabin full of watching eyes before stepping onto the jet bridge. The last glimpse the passengers had of Jamal was his small figure following the airport staff member down the dimly lit jet bridge, his shoulders slumped in defeat as the aircraft door closed behind him. Linda moved through the aisle, helping a middle-aged man store his carry-on in the overhead compartment. As she reached up, her eyes drifted to the newspaper he held. There, on the front page, was a face that made her heart stop. A young boy with familiar deep brown eyes and a gentle expression. "Excuse me," Linda said, her voice suddenly tight. "May I see that newspaper for a moment?" The passenger handed it over, and Linda's hands trembled as she read the headline, "Young Hero to Receive Presidential Honor." Below it was Jamal's photo, the same boy she had just removed from the flight. Her eyes raced across the text. 11-year-old Jamal Thompson displayed extraordinary courage during last week's bombing at Central Station. Despite the chaos and danger, the young orphan guided several people to safety, including 2 elderly individuals and a mother with her infant. His quick thinking and selfless actions saved multiple lives. Linda's stomach churned as she continued reading. The White House has invited young Jamal to Washington, D.C. to receive the Presidential Medal of Valor, making him the youngest recipient in the award's history. The newspaper shook in her hands. The boy she had judged as a liability, the child she had removed from the flight. He was a hero. He had been on his way to receive one of the nation's highest honors. "Oh God," she whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. The weight of her mistake crashed over her like a wave. She had let her assumptions and biases cloud her judgment, treating a brave young boy like a troublemaker simply because of his appearance and nervous behavior. Memories of his trembling hands and pleading eyes flashed through her mind. Of course he had been nervous. He was an orphan about to receive a presidential honor. His spilled water and dropped bag weren't signs of trouble. They were the natural actions of an overwhelmed child facing one of the biggest moments of his life. "I need to speak to the captain," Linda said, hastily returning the newspaper to its owner. She rushed toward the cockpit, her heart pounding. This had to be fixed immediately. Reaching the front of the plane, she pressed the intercom button. "Captain, this is Linda. I need to speak with you urgently about a passenger we just deplaned." After a brief conversation with the captain, Linda grabbed the crew phone and dialed ground operations. "This is Linda Matthews from Flight 2473. The young boy we just removed from the flight, Jamal Thompson. We need him back on board immediately. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Her voice cracked with emotion as she explained the situation to the ground staff. "He's supposed to receive a Presidential Medal of Valor in Washington. Please, we have to find him right away. This is my mistake, and I need to make it right." The ground staff member gently guided Jamal back onto the plane, his hand resting lightly on the boy's back. His small frame seemed even tinier as he stepped through the boarding door, clutching his worn backpack close to his chest like a shield against the world. The cabin fell completely silent, save for the soft hum of the aircraft's ventilation system and the distant rumble of engines being prepared for takeoff. Passengers who had been chatting or reading suddenly stopped, their attention drawn to the unexpected return, some craning their necks to get a better view. Linda stood at the front of the cabin, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her face etched with genuine remorse. As Jamal approached, walking with careful steps down the narrow aisle, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and turned to address the entire cabin, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to make an important announcement." Linda's voice carried clearly through the quiet cabin, strong despite her obvious emotional state. "I made a serious mistake earlier, and I owe this young man and all of you an explanation." She looked down at Jamal, who kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed strap of his backpack. "This is Jamal, and he's not just any passenger. Last week he saved multiple lives during the downtown marketplace bombing." A collective murmur rippled through the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. Linda continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident. Jamal noticed suspicious activity and warned authorities. Then, instead of running to safety, he helped evacuate elderly vendors and children before the blast. His quick thinking and bravery saved many lives that day, and he did it without hesitation or thought for himself. Several passengers leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration and awe. Some whispered to their seatmates, sharing shocked looks and gestures. Linda placed both hands on Jamal's shoulders, facing him directly, her eyes meeting his. "Jamal, I am deeply sorry for doubting you and for removing you from this flight. I let assumptions cloud my judgment, and that was wrong." Her voice cracked slightly with emotion, and she had to pause to compose herself. "You're not just a passenger on this plane, you're a hero, and we're privileged to have you aboard." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause, the sound swelling until it filled every corner of the aircraft. Passengers who had earlier cast suspicious glances now smiled warmly at Jamal, some wiping away tears. Some called out words of encouragement and praise, their voices joining the chorus of support. "Way to go, young man," shouted someone from the back, followed by enthusiastic clapping. "We're sorry too, Jamal," added a woman near the front, her eyes glistening with tears as she clutched a tissue. "Thank you for your bravery." Jamal, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and praise, managed a shy nod, his cheeks flushing pink. His shoulders relaxed slightly as Linda guided him back to his seat, her hand protective and maternal on his back. The applause continued to fill the cabin, accompanied now by warm smiles and nods of respect from every direction. The plane lifted smoothly into the air, leaving the ground behind as it climbed through wispy clouds into the bright morning sky. Jamal pressed his face close to the window, watching as the city below grew smaller and smaller until the buildings looked like tiny dots on a map. His fingers traced invisible patterns on the cool glass, his breath creating small patches of fog that quickly disappeared. Linda moved through the cabin, attending to her regular duties, but her eyes kept returning to Jamal. She noticed how his shoulders remained tense, how he seemed to make himself as small as possible in his seat. The guilt weighed heavily on her heart as she watched him. After the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding, Linda gathered a selection of snacks and drinks onto her service cart. She wheeled it to Jamal's row and paused, taking a moment to compose herself. "Would you like something to eat or drink, Jamal?" she asked softly, keeping her voice gentle and warm. "We have chocolate chip cookies, pretzels, and some fruit juice." Jamal turned from the window, his dark eyes meeting hers briefly before dropping to look at the snacks. "Yes, please," he whispered. "Could I have the cookies?" Linda smiled, carefully placing 2 packages of cookies and an apple juice on his tray table. "Of course, and here's some juice too." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you like flying? Is this your first time on a plane?" "Yes, it is," Jamal replied quietly, carefully opening the cookie package. "I like watching the clouds. They look like cotton candy up here." Linda's smile widened at his observation. "They do, don't they?" I've been flying for years, but I never get tired of that view. She paused, watching as he took a small bite of cookie. Are you heading to Washington for something special? Jamal nodded, swallowing before speaking. There's a ceremony. They want to give me an award. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. That's wonderful, Linda replied, her heart aching at his modesty. You deserve it, Jamal. What you did was incredibly brave. Jamal just shrugged, turning back to look out the window. His fingers played with the cookie wrapper as clouds drifted past outside. Linda could see he wasn't ready for more conversation, so she straightened up and gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. As she moved away to tend to other passengers, Linda watched from the galley as Jamal's posture gradually relaxed. His shoulders dropped their defensive hunch, and his movements became less guarded as he enjoyed his snacks. The morning sun streaming through the window cast a warm glow around him, and for the first time since boarding, he looked like what he was, just a young boy on an adventure. Linda busied herself with her duties, but her thoughts kept returning to their brief interaction. She noticed how Jamal's eyes would occasionally drift to the clouds outside, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth when he spotted particularly interesting formations. The sight brought both relief and a renewed sense of regret to her heart, knowing that her earlier actions had nearly prevented him from experiencing this journey. The plane touched down smoothly at Reagan National Airport, its wheels making gentle contact with the runway. Through the window, Jamal could see the iconic Washington Monument piercing the sky in the distance. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of seatbelts clicking and overhead compartments opening as passengers prepared to leave. Linda noticed an unusual amount of activity near the gate as she peered through the small window in the aircraft door. Camera flashes sparkled through the terminal windows, and a crowd had gathered near the jet bridge entrance. Looks like you have quite the welcome party, Jamal, Linda said softly, turning to where he sat still buckled in his seat. Would you like me to help you with your bag? Jamal nodded, his eyes wide as he too spotted the gathering crowd. His fingers fumbled with the seatbelt buckle, betraying his nervousness. Other passengers whispered and pointed, some taking out their phones to capture the moment. As the door opened and passengers began to file out, Linda retrieved Jamal's worn backpack from the overhead compartment. She gestured for him to wait until most passengers had departed, protecting him from the rush. Many smiled at him as they passed, some even stopping to shake his hand. The terminal buzzed with excitement as Jamal emerged from the jet bridge. Camera flashes erupted, and reporters thrust microphones forward. There he is, someone shouted, and applause broke out across the gate area. Regular travelers stopped to watch, many joining in the clapping when they realized who he was. Jamal froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the attention. Linda placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, providing silent support as he faced the crowd. The reporters called out questions, their voices overlapping. How does it feel to be in Washington? Are you excited about the ceremony? Can you tell us about the day of the bombing? Jamal stood straight, his small frame somehow appearing taller as he faced the cameras. Though his hands twisted nervously at the straps of his backpack, his face showed a quiet dignity. A slight smile appeared on his face, shy but genuine, as more people gathered to welcome him. Linda watched from a few steps behind, her heart swelling with pride at how this young boy handled himself. The morning's misunderstanding felt far away now as she witnessed the impact this humble child had on everyone around him. The crowd's warmth and admiration washed over Jamal like a gentle wave, and Linda could see his shoulders gradually relaxing as he realized he was truly welcome here. He was driven to his hotel, where the ceremony would be conducted too. The grand ballroom of the Washington Plaza Hotel sparkled with elegant decorations and bright lights. Jamal stood in front of a full-length mirror, barely recognizing himself in the crisp new suit that had been specially tailored for him. The dark blue fabric felt strange against his skin, so different from his usual worn clothes. An event coordinator adjusted his tie and smoothed down his collar. You look very handsome, Jamal, she said warmly. Are you ready? Through the doors, Jamal could hear the steady hum of hundreds of voices as people filled the ceremony hall. His hands felt clammy, and his heart thumped rapidly in his chest. He took a deep breath and nodded. The ballroom was packed with people in formal attire, politicians, military officers, and other distinguished guests. As Jamal entered from the side door, several heads turned his way, and encouraging smiles greeted him. He was guided to a seat in the front row next to where Linda sat in her airline uniform, having been invited as a special guest. The ceremony began with the national anthem, followed by a series of speakers who approached the podium. The Secretary of Homeland Security spoke first, describing the importance of civilian courage. Then, a survivor from the bombing shared her emotional account of that day, her voice breaking as she described how an 11-year-old boy had saved her life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Master of Ceremonies announced, his voice filling the hall, "please welcome to the stage Jamal Abdullah." The entire room rose to their feet. The applause was deafening, echoing off the high ceiling. Jamal stood slowly, his legs feeling shaky. As he walked toward the stairs leading to the stage, the clapping continued, joined by cheers and whistles. Once he reached center stage, the lights dimmed and a large screen descended. The video began playing, showing the aftermath of the bombing. News footage captured Jamal, covered in dust, leading people to safety. Survivors spoke about how this young boy had guided them through smoke and debris, returning multiple times to help others despite the danger. When the lights came back up, the secretary approached Jamal with a gleaming medal on a blue ribbon. "For extraordinary courage and selflessness in the face of danger," he proclaimed, placing the medal around Jamal's neck, "we present you with the National Medal of Valor." The audience erupted in another standing ovation. Jamal stepped to the microphone, looking tiny behind the large podium. His voice came out soft but clear. "Thank you," he said simply. "I just did what anyone would do. When I saw people needed help, I couldn't walk away." He paused, his fingers touching the medal. "This is for everyone who was there that day. We all helped each other." The simplicity and humility of his words brought tears to many eyes in the audience. As the applause swelled once more, Jamal carefully descended the stairs, the weight of the medal unfamiliar against his chest. His heart felt full and his mind struggled to process the magnitude of the moment. Back on the floor level, he looked down at the medal, still amazed that his actions had led to this moment of recognition. The next day, Jamal flew back on an uneventful flight, back to his hometown. He boarded the bus from the airport. The bus rolled into the familiar streets of Jamal's neighborhood, its wheels crunching over the uneven pavement. Through the window, he could see the old buildings and corner stores he knew so well. The medal from the ceremony was carefully wrapped in tissue paper and tucked into his backpack. As he stepped off the bus, a chorus of cheers erupted. Dozens of familiar faces had gathered to welcome him home. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store waved enthusiastically, while Mr. Chen from the laundromat held up a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome home, hero." "Jamal! Jamal!" Children from the neighborhood rushed forward, surrounding him with excited chatter. Some reached out to touch his backpack, knowing the medal was inside. Their eyes shone with admiration for their friend who had become a national hero. The crowd parted slightly as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison approached. Mr. Harrison wore his usual neat business suit, though his tie was loosened in the afternoon heat. Mrs. Harrison, elegant in a simple blue dress, carried a small bouquet of flowers. "Welcome back, Jamal," Mrs. Harrison said warmly, handing him the flowers. "We've been following all the news about the ceremony. We're so proud of you." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Jamal, if you have a moment, my wife and I would like to speak with you privately." They walked to a quiet corner of the nearby park, away from the celebrating crowd. The three of them sat on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree. Jamal noticed Mrs. Harrison's hands fidgeting with her purse strap, while Mr. Harrison seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Jamal," Mr. Harrison began, his voice gentle, "Martha and I have been thinking a lot about you, especially since the bombing incident." He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "We've been married for 15 years, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to have children of our own." Mrs. Harrison leaned forward slightly. "What my husband is trying to say, Jamal, is that we've grown very fond of you. We've watched how you care for others in the community, even before your heroic act. Your kindness and courage have touched our hearts." "We would like to adopt you, Jamal," Mr. Harrison said directly. "We want to give you a family, a home, and opportunities for education and a better future." Jamal's eyes widened. He looked between the two adults, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. The sounds of the celebration in the distance seemed to fade away as he processed their words. "We know this is a big decision," Mrs. Harrison added softly. "We don't expect an answer right away." Jamal swallowed hard, his mind swirling with thoughts of having a real family, a proper home, parents who would care for him. But he also thought about his community, the only family he'd known until now. I need some time to think about it," Jamal said quietly. "Is that okay?" "Of course," Mr. Harrison replied, placing a gentle hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready to give us your answer." The night air was cool on the rooftop of the community center. Jamal sat with his legs crossed, gazing up at the stars that managed to peek through the city's light pollution. The medal from the ceremony lay in his lap, catching occasional glints from the streetlights below. Down in the streets, he could hear the usual evening sounds: children playing their last games before bedtime, music drifting from open windows, and the distant rumble of traffic. This was the symphony of the only home he'd ever known. "A real family," he whispered to himself, testing how the words felt. The Harrisons' offer seemed almost too good to be true, a chance at a different life, with parents who could give him opportunities he'd never dreamed of. But doubt gnawed at his heart. Standing up, Jamal carefully tucked the medal into his pocket and made his way down the fire escape. He knew exactly who he needed to talk to. His first stop was Ms. Gloria's apartment. The elderly woman had been feeding neighborhood kids for 3 decades, and her wisdom was as nourishing as her famous chicken soup. He found her in her tiny kitchen, where the smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air. "The Harrisons are good people," Ms. Gloria said, pushing a plate of cookies toward him. "But good people don't always mean they're the right people. You need to listen to your heart, child." Next, he visited Mr. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who ran the community library from his garage. Books lined every wall, and the old man sat in his worn leather chair, listening intently as Jamal shared his concerns. "Change is scary," Mr. Rodriguez said, adjusting his thick glasses. "But sometimes the scariest changes bring the most beautiful rewards. Think about what you want your future to look like, Jamal." As he walked through the neighborhood, some of the younger kids spotted him. They ran up, full of excitement about his award ceremony. "Did you meet the president?" 7-year-old Tommy asked, eyes wide with wonder. "Show us your medal," Maria begged, bouncing on her toes. Watching their eager faces, Jamal felt the weight of his decision even more. These kids looked up to him. Would leaving mean abandoning them? His final visit was to Mrs. Chen, who had given him odd jobs at her convenience store since he was 8. She was counting inventory when he arrived, but immediately set aside her clipboard when she saw his troubled expression. "Sometimes," she said, offering him a candy bar like she used to when he was younger. "We think we must choose between 2 worlds. But perhaps the real blessing is being able to bridge them." "But what if I change?" Jamal asked, voicing one of his deepest fears. "What if I become different?" Mrs. Chen smiled gently. "Growth doesn't mean losing who you are, Jamal. It means becoming more of who you're meant to be." The evening grew late as Jamal thanked each mentor for their time and wisdom. Their words swirled in his mind like leaves in the wind, each offering a different perspective on his dilemma. Though the path ahead wasn't yet clear, their guidance had given him much to think about. As he walked home, Jamal decided to take a few more days to consider everything he'd heard. The decision ahead was too important to rush. The morning sun warmed the worn playground equipment at Thompson Park as Jamal made his way to the familiar meeting spot. His friends were already there, Marcus and Deshawn shooting hoops, while Sarah and Miguel sat on the rusty swings, sharing a bag of chips. "Hey guys," Jamal called out, his voice slightly shaky. "Can we talk for a minute?" The basketball thumped to a stop as his friends gathered around the picnic table where they'd shared countless lunches and conversations. Little Tommy and a few other younger kids lingered nearby, always eager to be near the older group. "The Harrisons want to adopt me," Jamal said quietly. studying his hands on the weathered wood. Sarah's eyes widened. The ones who live in that nice house on Cedar Street? Yeah, Jamal nodded. They talked to me after the ceremony. Marcus leaned forward. Man, that's huge. They got that big backyard with a pool and everything. Remember when we used to dream about having a pool? Deshaun chuckled, bumping Jamal's shoulder. We'd talk about it while splashing around in that broken fire hydrant during summer. The memory brought smiles to their faces. Miguel pulled out his phone, showing a photo from 2 years ago. All of them covered in mud after trying to build a fort during a rainstorm. Remember this? He grinned. Your clothes were so dirty, Mrs. Chen made you wash them in her sink before letting you go home. Sarah's voice grew soft. We've been through a lot together, haven't we? Like when we all pitched in to buy your school supplies last year. Or when you helped me study for that big math test, Marcus added. You're the reason I passed, man. Tommy piped up from nearby. And you taught me how to tie my shoes. Jamal felt his throat tighten. I don't know what to do. This place, you guys, it's all I know. But think about it, Sarah said gently. You could go to that good school near their house. Maybe even college someday. Cedar Street's not that far, Miguel pointed out. You could still visit. We're not going anywhere. Deshaun nodded. Yeah, and you could tell us all about your fancy new life. His teasing tone made everyone laugh. For real, though, Marcus said, his voice serious. You deserve this chance, Jamal. After everything you've done for everyone here, maybe it's time something good happened for you. The younger kids had edged closer during the conversation. Tommy tugged at Jamal's sleeve. Will you still come to my birthday party if you move? Course he will, Sarah answered before Jamal could. He'll always be part of our family here. As the afternoon light began to fade, they shared more stories about their adventures, their mishaps, their victories and defeats. Each memory seemed more precious now, weighted with new meaning. When it was time to leave, his friends surrounded him in a group hug. Whatever you decide, Marcus said, speaking for all of them, we've got your back. Jamal walked home through the familiar streets, carrying both the warmth of their support and the heaviness of his choice. The sleek law office buzzed with anticipation as Jamal sat in a plush leather chair, his feet barely touching the polished floor. His new sneakers, a recent gift from the Harrisons, reflected the warm, overhead lighting. Mr. Harrison sat beside him, radiating confidence as he reviewed the stack of adoption papers with their lawyer, Ms. Peterson. Mrs. Harrison squeezed Jamal's hand reassuringly from his other side, her wedding ring cool against his palm. Everything appears to be in order, Ms. Peterson said, adjusting her reading glasses and smoothing her silk blouse. We'll need signatures here, and... Her phone buzzed sharply against the mahogany desk, making Jamal jump slightly. Excuse me, I need to take this. She stepped out of the office, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome. Through the glass walls, they could see her expression change from professional politeness to concern, her shoulders tensing visibly with each passing moment. The adoption agency representative, Mr. Torres, filled the silence by explaining the next steps, his voice warm and practiced. After the paperwork is complete, we'll schedule home visits and... Ms. Peterson returned, her face tight with discomfort, a slight flush creeping up her neck. Mr. Harrison, could we speak privately for a moment? Mr. Harrison's smile faltered, creating tiny creases around his mouth. Anything you need to say can be said here. Very well. Ms. Peterson cleared her throat, shuffling the papers in front of her nervously. Our background check has revealed some irregularities. There appeared to be past accusations of financial misconduct. The room grew still, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning overhead. Mrs. Harrison's hand tightened around Jamal's, her wedding ring pressing into his fingers. That was years ago, Mr. Harrison said, his voice rising slightly, a hint of desperation creeping in. Those issues were resolved. I paid my fines. I made amends. Nevertheless, Ms. Peterson continued, her words measured and careful, we need to investigate further. Any history of financial impropriety must be thoroughly reviewed in adoption cases. I made mistakes, Mr. Harrison admitted, running a hand through his graying hair, his wedding band catching the light. "I was younger, more focused on profits than people, but I've changed. I've spent years trying to make up for it through our charitable foundation." Mr. Torres leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave, his tie slightly askew. "We appreciate your honesty, Mr. Harrison, but we have a responsibility to ensure every adoption is in the child's best interest." Jamal sat quietly, looking between the adults as they discussed his future, his stomach churning with uncertainty. The excitement that had filled the room earlier evaporated, replaced by a heavy tension that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders like an invisible weight. The meeting ended early with Ms. Peterson promising to be in touch once she had reviewed all the information. As they gathered their things, Jamal noticed Mr. Harrison's hands trembling slightly as he collected the papers, struggling to align their edges. The walk to the elevator was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts about what these revelations might mean for their hopes of becoming a family. The morning news hit like a thunderclap. "Local philanthropist's dark past exposed," screamed the headlines across the front page of the city newspaper. Within hours, the story of Mr. Harrison's financial misconduct spread from local papers to national news networks. Reporters descended on the city like hungry wolves, each trying to uncover more details about Mr. Harrison's past. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. The story grew bigger with each passing hour. Sources reveal that Harrison Industries manipulated stock prices in 2015, one reporter announced on the evening news. Multiple investors lost their life savings in what authorities called a sophisticated scheme. Another news channel dug deeper. Harrison's charitable work began shortly after paying substantial fines for financial irregularities. Critics question whether his philanthropy is genuine or merely an attempt to rehabilitate his image. Social media exploded with opinions. People who had once praised Mr. Harrison's charitable work now questioned every donation, every kind gesture. Call-in radio shows buzzed with angry voices. "It's obvious what he's doing," a caller stated on popular morning radio. "He's using this poor orphan boy, this hero, to clean up his reputation. It's disgusting." The speculation about the adoption grew more intense. "Harrison adoption, noble act or calculated PR move," read one online headline. News segments analyzed Mr. Harrison's every past action, painting pictures of a calculating businessman rather than a caring potential father. "The timing is suspicious," a media analyst commented on a national morning show. Just as interest in his past misconduct was resurfacing, he announces his intention to adopt the boy who's been making headlines for his heroism. It seems too convenient to be coincidental. In his small room at the community center, Jamal sat cross-legged on his bed, watching his small television. The news anchor's voice filled the room. Questions continue to surface about Harrison's true motives in the high-profile adoption case. Is this genuine care for a child in need, or merely another calculated move from a man with a history of deception? The screen showed clips of Mr. Harrison at various charity events, but now they were played in slow motion, accompanied by ominous background music. Every smile, every handshake was analyzed and questioned. Jamal's own image appeared occasionally, photos from the award ceremony mixed with footage of Mr. Harrison's business dealings. The reporter's voice continued. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Harrison's sudden interest in adoption coincided with growing scrutiny of his business practices. Critics argue that associating himself with Jamal, whose recent heroic actions captured national attention, could be seen as an attempt to deflect from his controversial past. Jamal's hands clutched his blanket tightly as he watched the stream of negative coverage. Each new revelation, each questioning headline, felt like another weight being added to his shoulders. The Mr. Harrison he knew, the kind man who had offered him a home and family, seemed to be disappearing beneath an avalanche of accusations and suspicions. Jamal sat on his thin mattress, the television's glow casting shadows on the community center's worn walls. The constant stream of news about Mr. Harrison swirled in his mind like leaves caught in a storm. He switched off the TV, but the silence felt even heavier than the noise. Through his small window, he could see reporters still lingering on the street, their cameras ready. Some held microphones, hoping to catch anyone who might share insights about the Harrisons or Jamal himself. The sight made his stomach twist. Getting up, Jamal paced the small room, his footsteps quiet on the creaky floorboards. The award medal from Washington sat on his rickety bedside table, catching the afternoon light. Next to it lay the adoption paperwork, half completed, the corners already worn from his constant handling. When he ventured out for lunch, his friends tried to engage him in their usual games and conversations. "Want to play soccer, Jamal?" asked Miguel, holding up their worn ball. But Jamal just shook his head, managing a weak smile. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store stopped him as he passed. "Mi hijo, what do you think about all this news?" Her concerned eyes searched his face, but Jamal merely shrugged and hurried past. The questions followed him everywhere. "Did you know about Mr. Harrison's past? Are you still going through with the adoption? What does your community think?" Each inquiry felt like a small pin pricking his skin. Unable to bear the attention any longer, Jamal slipped away from the community center through the back alley he knew so well. His feet carried him through familiar narrow passages between buildings, past clotheslines heavy with washing, and around corners marked with childhood memories. He found himself walking toward the abandoned lot where he used to hide when life felt overwhelming. The space between two old buildings offered a quiet refuge, hidden from prying eyes. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and an old wooden crate served as his seat. Settling down, Jamal pulled his knees to his chest. The sounds of the slum, children playing, vendors calling, music drifting from windows, felt distant here. In this space, he could finally breathe. The Harrisons had shown him nothing but kindness. Mr. Harrison's gentle smile and Mrs. Harrison's warm hugs felt genuine, but now doubt crept in like shadow at sunset. Was it all just for show? Were the news reporters right? His community had raised him, protected him, celebrated his achievements. These streets, despite their poverty, held all his memories. The thought of leaving brought a lump to his throat. Jamal picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands. Like this stone, he felt worn smooth by forces beyond his control. The decision ahead seemed too big for his 11-year-old shoulders to carry alone. Looking up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings, Jamal realized he needed help. Not just any help, but wisdom from people who could see things clearer than he could right now. He needed guidance to understand not just the facts about Mr. Harrison, but what they meant for his future. The community center's familiar scent of old books and wood polish welcomed Jamal as he stepped through its doors. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and the afternoon light streamed through the dusty windows, creating warm patches on the worn carpet. Mrs. Chen, who had taught reading classes at the center for 20 years, sat in her usual corner. Her gray hair was tied neatly back, and her kind eyes brightened when she saw Jamal approach. "I've been expecting you," she said softly, setting aside her book. "The news has been difficult to ignore." Jamal settled into the chair across from her, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mrs. Chen." "Sometimes the brightest opportunities come with the darkest shadows," she replied, adjusting her glasses. "But remember, you've faced uncertainty before and emerged stronger." Down the hall, Mr. Rodriguez, the retired social worker, listened intently as Jamal shared his concerns. His weathered hands folded on his desk, he leaned forward. "Money troubles don't always mean a bad heart, Jamal, but they do mean you should ask careful questions." In the small garden behind the center, Sister Maria tended to her herbs as she spoke with Jamal. Her practical wisdom, earned through decades of helping the community, came through clearly. "Trust your instincts, child. They've served you well before, but don't let fear of the unknown stop you from growing." Mr. Thompson, who ran the center's sports programs, sat with Jamal on the old bleachers. "Sometimes people make mistakes, son. The real measure is how they handle those mistakes and what they learn from them." Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle in Jamal's mind. Their words carried the weight of experience and genuine care for his well-being. "You're not just choosing a family," Ms. Baker, his former teacher, reminded him. "You're choosing a path for your future. But remember, paths can have many branches." The afternoon wore on as Jamal moved from mentor to mentor. Some offered practical advice about asking direct questions. Others emphasized the importance of following his heart while keeping his head clear. Mr. Washington, the center's director for over 30 years, summarized what many had expressed. "You've grown into a thoughtful young man, Jamal. We've all seen it. Whatever you decide, this community will always be your foundation." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the center's windows, Jamal felt the weight of his situation shift. The confusion that had clouded his mind began to clear, replaced by a quiet determination. His mentor's words had reminded him of something important. He had the right to seek answers directly. Standing in the center's main hall, where he had spent countless hours over the years, Jamal made his decision. He would speak with Mr. Harrison face to face. The media stories and speculation couldn't tell him what he needed to know. Only an honest conversation with the man himself would help him understand the truth. The conference room at the Grand Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Camera flashes lit up the space as Mr. Harrison approached the podium, his wife standing supportively at his side. His usually confident stance was tempered by a visible humility as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "I'm here to address the recent revelations about my past and to be completely honest with you all." The room fell silent as Mr. Harrison took a deep breath. 15 years ago, I made decisions in my business dealings that I deeply regret. I manipulated financial records to avoid taxes and misrepresented investments to several clients. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of reporters. Mrs. Harrison reached out and squeezed her husband's arm gently. "When these actions came to light, I faced the consequences," he continued. "I paid all outstanding debts with interest, cooperated fully with authorities, and spent 3 years working with financial literacy programs in low-income communities as part of my commitment to make amends." Mr. Harrison's voice grew stronger as he spoke about his journey of redemption. "These past mistakes have shaped who I am today. They taught me about integrity, responsibility, and the importance of giving back to society." Turning to the matter of Jamal, his expression softened. "Our desire to adopt Jamal has nothing to do with improving my image. My wife and I have been unable to have children of our own, and we've spent years working with youth programs in underprivileged communities. When we met Jamal, we saw not just his incredible act of bravery, but a remarkable young man who deserves every opportunity life can offer." The question and answer session that followed was intense. Reporters pressed for details about his past misconduct and his current financial status. "Mr. Harrison, how can the public trust your intentions with Jamal given your history of deception?" one reporter called out. "I can only show through my actions that I've changed," he responded, maintaining eye contact. "Every step I've taken since my mistakes has been documented and verified. I welcome any scrutiny of my current business practices and charitable work." Another reporter stood. "Are you concerned these revelations might affect Jamal's decision about the adoption?" Mrs. Harrison stepped forward to the microphone. "We believe in complete honesty with Jamal. We want him to make his decision with full knowledge of who we are, both our past mistakes and our present commitment to doing what's right." As the conference continued, Mr. Harrison answered each question directly, never deflecting or minimizing his past actions. Some reporters nodded appreciatively at his candor, while others maintained skeptical expressions and continued their pointed questioning. Jamal sat cross-legged on the worn couch in the community center's TV room, his eyes fixed on the screen as Mr. Harrison's press conference played out. Around him, a few of his friends and mentors watched in respectful silence, occasionally nodding or exchanging glances. As Mr. Harrison spoke about his past mistakes, Jamal studied the man's face carefully. There was something different about him now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. The usual confident businessman had been replaced by someone more human, more real. "He's being straight with everyone," remarked Old Joe, one of Jamal's longtime mentors during a commercial break. "That takes guts." Over the next few days, Jamal spent time with different people who mattered to him, seeking their thoughts. In the community garden where he often helped tend vegetables, Miss Sarah shared her wisdom while picking tomatoes. "People can change, child," she said, handing him a basket. "The question is whether they want to. From what I see, Mr. Harrison's doing more than just talking about it." Later that week, Mrs. Harrison visited Jamal at the community center. They sat in the quiet reading room, sharing cookies she'd baked herself. "I know this is a lot to process," she said gently, her kind eyes meeting his. "John, Mr. Harrison, wanted me to tell you that whatever you decide, we respect your choice. We just want you to know who we really are, mistakes and all." Jamal nodded, appreciating her honesty. The things he said at the press conference, they seemed real. "They were," Mrs. Harrison replied softly. "We've both learned that hiding the truth only makes things worse." His friends had their own takes on the situation. During a pickup basketball game, his best friend Marcus spoke between shots. "Your life could be really different with them," Marcus said, passing the ball to Jamal. "But different doesn't mean you have to forget where you came from." The media coverage shifted too. While some reporters remained skeptical, others began highlighting Mr. Harrison's transparency and his years of quiet community service. Jamal watched as local people who had benefited from Mr. Harrison's financial literacy programs came forward to share their stories. In the peaceful moments of early morning, Jamal would sit on his favorite rooftop, watching the sun rise over the city. He thought about Mr. Harrison's confession, about the way he'd faced his past head-on. He thought about Mrs. Harrison's gentle kindness and their shared conversations. The community's response surprised him most of all. Instead of warning him away, they encouraged him to consider the opportunity. Even his toughest critics among the elders admitted that Mr. Harrison's honesty had impressed them. Sometimes the people who've made mistakes understand their value better than those who haven't, his favorite teacher, Mr. Wilson, told him during a thoughtful conversation. As the days passed, Jamal felt increasingly certain about his path forward. The Harrisons' willingness to be transparent about their flaws, combined with their genuine care for him, touched something deep inside him. He recognized that they weren't perfect, but their honesty made him trust them more, not less. One evening, sitting in his usual spot in the community center, Jamal realized he was ready to make his decision. The support of his community, the Harrisons' sincerity, and his own growing confidence all pointed toward the same conclusion. He wanted to move forward with the adoption. The family court buzzed with quiet energy as Jamal sat between Mr. and Mrs. Harrison on a polished wooden bench. His new suit felt stiff, but Mrs. Harrison had helped him pick it out specially for this day. Their attorney sat nearby, organizing papers on the desk in front of them. Judge Martinez entered the courtroom, her black robes swishing as she took her place behind the bench. Everyone rose, then settled back down at her signal. Jamal's heart thumped against his ribs as she began reviewing the documents. "I see all the home study reports are in order," Judge Martinez noted, adjusting her reading glasses. "And the background checks and financial statements have been thoroughly vetted." The child welfare representative, Ms. Chen, stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. We've conducted multiple visits to the Harrison home and interviewed Jamal extensively. All requirements have been met, and we believe this adoption serves Jamal's best interests." The judge turned her attention to Jamal. "Young man, I understand you've had time to think about this decision. Do you want Mr. and Mrs. Harrison to be your parents?" Jamal's voice came out clear and steady. "Yes, Your Honor. They've shown me what family means, even when things got hard." Mr. Harrison squeezed Jamal's shoulder gently as Mrs. Harrison dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," the judge continued, "are you committed to providing Jamal with a loving home and supporting his continued connection to his community?" "We are, Your Honor," they responded in unison. Mr. Harrison added, "We understand the responsibility we're taking on, and we're ready to be the parents Jamal deserves." Judge Martinez reviewed the final papers before her. The only sound in the courtroom was the gentle whir of the ceiling fan and the shuffling of documents. After what felt like forever to Jamal, she looked up with a warm smile. "Having reviewed all documentation and heard from all parties, I find this adoption to be in the best interest of the child. The petition for adoption is hereby approved." The gavel's sharp crack made it official. Mrs. Harrison burst into happy tears, pulling Jamal into a tight hug. Mr. Harrison wrapped his arms around them both, his usual composure cracking as his eyes grew misty. Outside the courtroom, the new family stood together, still processing the moment. Jamal found himself sandwiched between his new parents and another embrace, feeling a mixture of joy and relief wash over him. The uncertainty of the past months had finally given way to something solid and real. He had a family. The morning sun streamed through Jamal's bedroom window, casting warm patterns on his desk. His new room, spacious and filled with books, still felt surreal after 2 months with the Harrisons. The quiet of the suburban neighborhood was different from the constant buzz of his old community, but he was slowly getting used to it. Mrs. Harrison knocked gently on his door. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart. Dad's already downstairs." At the breakfast table, Mr. Harrison looked up from his tablet. "There's a meeting at the community center today about the education initiative. Would you like to come along, Jamal?" Jamal nodded eagerly. The Harrisons had been supporting various community projects, and this one particularly interested him. He remembered the limited resources in his old neighborhood and how much difference even small improvements could make. Later that afternoon, Jamal sat in the community center's conference room, listening intently as local leaders discussed plans for after-school programs. When they asked for input, he raised his hand. "In my old neighborhood," Jamal began, his voice steady, "we didn't have many books or computers, but what helped us most were the mentors who spent time with us." The community leaders leaned forward, interested in his perspective. Mr. Harrison beamed with pride as Jamal continued sharing his experiences. Over the next few weeks, Jamal became increasingly involved in the initiative. He helped design a mentorship program that paired older students with younger ones, drawing from his own experiences. The program quickly gained traction, with more children signing up each week. During one session, Jamal sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a group of eager children. He showed them how to solve math problems using the same techniques his old community mentors had taught him. The children's eyes lit up as concepts became clear, reminding him of his own journey. Mrs. Harrison often volunteered alongside him, helping organize supplies and snacks for the sessions. She watched with pride as Jamal naturally connected with the children, bridging the gap between his past experiences and his present opportunities. "You know," she said one evening as they packed up supplies, "you've brought something special to this program. These kids really look up to you." Mr. Harrison added his support by securing additional funding for learning materials and computer equipment. He saw how Jamal's insights helped shape the program into something truly meaningful for the community. As Jamal led another group session, teaching kids about perseverance and the importance of education, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The familiar warmth of helping others, combined with the support of his new family, created a perfect blend of his past and present lives. And the morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as the Harrison family sat down for breakfast. Jamal noticed Mrs. Harrison's hands trembling slightly as she poured her coffee. Her face looked drawn and pale, lacking its usual warmth and energy. "Sarah, you don't look well," Mr. Harrison said, reaching across the table to touch his wife's hand. "You've been tired for weeks now. I really think you should see Dr. Thompson." Mrs. Harrison tried to smile, but even that seemed to require effort. "Maybe you're right," she admitted, setting down her barely touched toast. "I thought it was just stress, but I'll call and make an appointment right now," Mr. Harrison insisted, already reaching for his phone. 2 days later, the family sat in Dr. Thompson's office, surrounded by medical charts and diplomas on the walls. The doctor's expression was serious as she reviewed the test results. "Mrs. Harrison, the blood work and other tests indicate a chronic condition," Dr. Thompson explained gently. "It's an autoimmune disease that will require ongoing treatment and careful management." Jamal watched as Mrs. Harrison gripped her husband's hand tighter. The medical terms the doctor used seemed complicated, but the gravity of the situation was clear in everyone's faces. "What does this mean for her daily life?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice steady despite the concern evident in his eyes. Dr. Thompson leaned forward in her chair. "There will be good days and bad days. We'll start a treatment plan immediately, but Mrs. Harrison will need to reduce her activities and rest more. The condition can cause severe fatigue, joint pain, and other symptoms that will affect her energy levels. Back home, the family gathered in their living room. The usual comfort of the space felt different now, heavy with the weight of the news. Mrs. Harrison sat in her favorite armchair, looking small and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," she said softly, looking at both her husband and Jamal. "I know this will change things for all of us." Mr. Harrison moved to kneel beside her chair. "We're a family," he said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Jamal sat quietly on the couch watching his adoptive parents. His mind went to the community center programs, where Mrs. Harrison had been such an active volunteer. He thought about the morning rides to school she always gave him, and their evening talks over homework. "The doctor says with proper medication and rest we can manage this," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice gentle but determined. "We'll make whatever adjustments we need to make." Mrs. Harrison wiped away a tear. "I just don't want to let anyone down. The community programs, our routines." "You could never let us down," Mr. Harrison assured her, squeezing her hand. They sat together in the quiet room, each processing the news in their own way, united in their concern and love for one another. The early morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Jamal tied on an apron. He had been watching cooking videos online, determined to master simple meals that would help the family. His fingers moved carefully as he cracked eggs into a bowl just like he'd practiced. "Need any help?" Mr. Harrison asked, entering the kitchen still in his work clothes. "Could you chop these vegetables?" Jamal pointed to the carrots and celery on the cutting board. Mrs. Harrison mentioned she likes them in her scrambled eggs. They worked side by side, the quiet punctuated by the rhythmic sound of Mr. Harrison's knife against the board. Jamal had already learned that his adoptive father preferred comfortable silence to forced conversation. "You're getting pretty good at this," Mr. Harrison observed as Jamal expertly flipped the eggs. "When did you learn to cook?" "YouTube," Jamal admitted with a small smile. "I've been practicing when you're at work. The first few times were..." He wrinkled his nose. "Not so good." In the evenings, after Mrs. Harrison had gone to rest, Jamal and Mr. Harrison developed a routine. They would clean the kitchen together, pack leftovers for lunch the next day, and make sure all of Mrs. Harrison's medications were organized for the morning. "Did you notice Mom seemed stronger today?" Jamal asked one evening as he loaded the dishwasher. The word Mom still felt new on his tongue, but it came more naturally now. Mr. Harrison nodded, wiping down the counter. "The new medication seems to be helping, though we need to make sure she doesn't overdo it on the good days." They had learned to read the signs, when Mrs. Harrison needed rest, when she was pushing herself too hard, when she needed gentle encouragement to eat. Jamal had become particularly attuned to her energy levels, often bringing her water or a blanket before she even asked. One evening, after they had finished a dinner of Jamal's now perfected chicken soup, Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Jamal," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know how much your help has meant to me. The way you've stepped up, how you've taken care of your mother." He paused, collecting himself. "You've become more than we could have ever hoped for in a son." Jamal felt warmth spread through his chest, a feeling of belonging that had grown stronger with each passing day. In caring for Mrs. Harrison, in working alongside Mr. Harrison, he had found his place in this family, not just as someone who needed help, but as someone who could give it too. Jamal sat at his desk in the community center, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the budget spreadsheet on his laptop. The numbers painted a clear picture. The family's resources, once comfortably supporting his educational initiative, were now stretched thin by Mrs. Harrison's mounting medical bills. "These medical expenses weren't part of our original plan," he muttered, running his fingers through his hair. The cost of specialized treatments and new medications had created a significant dent in their finances. He called an emergency meeting with his small but dedicated team of staff and volunteers. They gathered in the center's main room, settling into the mismatched chairs arranged in a circle. "The situation is challenging," Jamal explained, his voice steady despite his concern, "but I believe we can find a solution together." Sarah, one of the senior volunteers, raised her hand. "What about local businesses?" Many of them have community support programs. That's exactly what I was thinking, Jamal nodded, pulling out a notebook. I've made a list of potential sponsors we could approach. The team spent the next hour brainstorming ideas. They identified several promising leads, from established corporations to successful local shops. Each team member contributed names of contacts they knew personally. Over the next few days, Jamal immersed himself in grant writing. He stayed late at the center, carefully crafting proposals that highlighted their program's success stories and community impact. Between writing sessions, he made phone calls and scheduled meetings with local business owners. Mr. Chen from the electronics store listened intently as Jamal presented his case. The bakery owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, took detailed notes during their meeting. Each conversation, while encouraging, ended without concrete commitments. Then came his meeting with Marcus Thompson, a local tech entrepreneur who had recently opened an office downtown. Jamal sat across from him in the sleek conference room, sharing his initiative's vision and challenges. What caught my attention, Marcus said, leaning forward, was how you've structured the program to create lasting change. Tell me more about your plans for expansion. As Jamal outlined their goals, he could see genuine interest in Marcus's eyes. The meeting concluded with Marcus expressing strong interest in becoming a major sponsor. Walking back to the community center, Jamal felt the weight on his shoulders beginning to lift. With this potential funding source, his initiative could not only continue, but possibly grow even stronger. Word of Mrs. Harrison's illness spread quickly through both communities. In the affluent neighborhood where the Harrisons lived, neighbors gathered in their book clubs and coffee shops, discussing ways to help the family that had given so much to local causes. Meanwhile, in Jamal's old slum community, the news traveled from rooftop to rooftop, through narrow alleyways where children played, and across crowded marketplaces. The Harrisons helped build our community center, said Mr. Kumar, an elder from the slum, during a meeting at the local tea shop. Now it's our turn to help them. In the following days, representatives from both communities came together at the community center. The room buzzed with energy as people from different walks of life shared ideas for the fundraiser. Mrs. Patel, who ran a small catering business in the slum, offered to coordinate the food stalls. Local musicians volunteered their talents, and artists from both communities promised to donate pieces for a charity auction. We could set up in the park between our neighborhoods, suggested Sarah from the planning committee. It's the perfect symbolic location, right between both communities. The preparations brought people together in unexpected ways. Wealthy business owners worked alongside street vendors to organize stalls. Children from the slum taught traditional games to kids from the suburbs, planning activity booths together. On the day of the fundraiser, the park transformed into a vibrant celebration of community spirit. Colorful banners stretched between trees, and the aroma of diverse cuisines filled the air. Local bands played on a small stage while children darted between food stalls and game stations. Mrs. Harrison, though weakened by her illness, insisted on attending. She sat in a comfortable chair under a shaded tent, greeting well-wishers with tears of gratitude in her eyes. Mr. Harrison stood beside her, squeezing her hand, visibly moved by the outpouring of support. As the evening approached, Jamal took the stage. Looking out at the crowd, a sea of familiar faces from both his past and present, he felt his heart swell with emotion. The fundraiser had exceeded all expectations, raising enough to cover several months of medical expenses and ensure the continuation of his community initiative. When I first moved to this neighborhood, Jamal began, his voice clear and strong, I thought I was leaving one community for another, but today I see that we're all one big community. Your generosity and support show that kindness knows no boundaries. The living room glowed with warm lamplight as the Harrison family settled in for their evening routine. Mrs. Harrison rested comfortably on the plush sofa, her legs propped up on an ottoman, while Mr. Harrison and Jamal sat nearby. Family photos spread across the coffee table told stories of different lives now intertwined. This was taken at my first business opening, Mr. Harrison said, pointing to a faded photograph. I was so nervous that day, my hands were shaking when I cut the ribbon. Jamal leaned in closer, studying the younger version of his adoptive father. Were you scared of failing? Terrified, Mr. Harrison admitted with a gentle laugh. But sometimes the scariest moments lead to the best changes in our lives. Mrs. Harrison reached for another album, wincing slightly as she moved. Without hesitation, Jamal stood to help her, adjusting her pillows with practiced care. Their daily physical therapy sessions had created a comfortable rhythm between them. "Thank you, dear," she said, patting his hand. "You know, this reminds me of when I was a teacher. There was this student who would always help me carry books to my car." During their therapy sessions, these kinds of stories flowed naturally. As Jamal helped Mrs. Harrison with her prescribed exercises, she shared tales of her teaching days, while he opened up about his life in the slum. Their conversations wandered through memories both bitter and sweet, building bridges of understanding. At dinner, they gathered around the table where their discussions grew deeper. Mr. Harrison spoke of lessons learned from his past mistakes, while Mrs. Harrison shared stories of students whose lives she'd touched. Jamal talked about the community that raised him, describing the strength he found in their unity. "The elders always told us that hardship builds character," Jamal said, passing the salt to Mr. Harrison. "I didn't understand what they meant until now." Mrs. Harrison's eyes grew misty. "Those elders were wise. Look at how their teachings helped shape you into who you are today." Later that evening, as they returned to the family albums, Mrs. Harrison pulled out a particular photo. It showed an empty space in their formal living room, taken years ago. "We always knew something was missing," she said softly, looking at Jamal. "Now I understand what it was. Who it was." The moment hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Jamal felt a warmth spread through his chest as he realized how completely he had become part of their family story. The therapy sessions, shared meals, and quiet evenings had woven them together in ways none of them had expected. "Your strength through all of this," Mrs. Harrison continued, touching his hand, "has been our strength too. You've brought so much more than just help into our home, Jamal. You've brought hope." Jamal adjusted his tie nervously as he stood in the gleaming lobby of Riverside Corporate Center. His presentation materials were neatly organized in his father's old briefcase, a gift that had brought tears to Mr. Harrison's eyes when he gave it to Jamal that morning. "Your future partnerships deserve to be carried in something special," Mr. Harrison had said. Now, facing the polished elevator doors, Jamal took a deep breath. The conference room on the 10th floor awaited him, along with 5 influential business leaders who could change everything for his initiative. The meeting room buzzed with quiet conversation as Jamal set up his presentation. He noticed how different this felt from his early days in the slum, yet the same determination that had helped him survive then drove him forward now. "Thank you all for being here today," Jamal began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm here to discuss how we can work together to transform lives in our community." As Jamal clicked through his carefully prepared slides, he shared stories of children much like his younger self, talented, determined, but lacking opportunities. He outlined plans for internship programs that would pair local businesses with promising students, detailed educational support systems, and presented costs and potential returns on investment. "What impresses me most," said Sarah Chen, CEO of Tech Solutions, "is how thoroughly you've considered the practical aspects. These aren't just dreams, they're actionable plans." Other business leaders nodded in agreement. Marcus Thompson from Thompson Construction leaned forward, particularly interested in the internship program. "We've been looking for ways to invest in local talent," he said. "This could be exactly what we need." The discussion flowed naturally into specifics, budgets, timelines, responsibilities. Jamal answered questions confidently, drawing from his experiences both in the slum and with the Harrisons' guidance. By meeting's end, 3 companies had committed to significant financial support, while 2 others offered to provide mentorship and training resources. Sarah Chen even suggested creating a technology education center within the existing community space. As Jamal gathered his materials, Marcus Thompson approached him. "You've got something special here," he said, extending his hand. "Let's make it happen." Back in his office at the community center, Jamal carefully reviewed the partnership agreements. Each signature represented new possibilities for kids who, like him not so long ago, were waiting for their chance to shine. His initiative wasn't just surviving anymore, it was growing into something bigger than he'd imagined. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital window as Mrs. Harrison's doctor reviewed her latest test results. Her face broke into a warm smile as she shared the news. Mrs. Harrison's condition had stabilized significantly, exceeding their initial expectations. "The treatment is working better than we hoped," the doctor explained, pointing to the charts. "Your body is responding well to the medications, and the latest readings show marked improvement." Mr. Harrison squeezed his wife's hand, tears glistening in his eyes. Jamal, who had been holding his breath without realizing it, felt his shoulders relax. The past months of careful meal planning, medication schedules, and gentle exercise routines had paid off. Back at home, the Harrison residence buzzed with quiet celebration. Close friends and community members who had supported them through the difficult times gathered in the living room. The coffee table held a spread of Mrs. Harrison's favorite treats, prepared by neighbors who had taken turns bringing meals during her toughest days. "I remember when Jamal first started learning to cook," Mrs. Harrison shared with the group, her eyes twinkling. "He was so determined to make my favorite soup just right. He must have practiced 5 times before he felt it was perfect." Their community center coordinator, Ms. Rodriguez, raised her glass. "This family has shown us what real strength looks like," she said. "Through everything, you've continued supporting others while taking care of each other." Mr. Harrison stood next, his voice thick with emotion. "These past months haven't been easy," he admitted, "but they've shown us what matters most. Jamal," he turned to his son, "you've been our rock through all of this. Your mother and I couldn't be prouder." As evening settled in, everyone gathered around the television where a slideshow began playing. Images flashed across the screen. Jamal helping Mrs. Harrison with her exercises, Mr. Harrison and Jamal cooking together, community members dropping off meals, the successful fundraiser that had brought everyone together. The photos told their story, moments of worry transformed into triumph, challenging days brightened by small victories, and most importantly, 3 people becoming a true family through it all. Watching the slideshow, surrounded by their closest supporters, the Harrisons held hands, their hearts full of gratitude and hope. The community center buzzed with excitement as hundreds of people gathered for the celebration. Colorful banners hung from the walls, displaying photos and success stories from Jamal's initiative. The aroma of various dishes filled the air as volunteers served food from long tables decorated with fresh flowers. Mrs. Harrison, looking healthier than she had in months, sat in the front row beside her husband. Their eyes sparkled with pride as they watched Jamal move through the crowd, greeting people from both his old neighborhood and their current community. The walls were lined with poster boards showcasing the initiative's achievements, statistics about educational improvements, testimonials from program participants, and plans for upcoming projects. Local business leaders who had partnered with the program stood chatting with community members, discussing the positive changes they'd witnessed. When it was time for speeches, the room fell silent as Jamal approached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, taking a deep breath before beginning. "A year ago, I was just a boy from the slum who happened to be in the right place at the right time," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Today, I stand before you not just as someone who received help, but as someone who has learned the true meaning of family and community." Jamal gestured toward the Harrisons. "My parents taught me that second chances aren't just about receiving opportunities. They're about creating them for others. Through their support, and despite our challenges, we've managed to build something meaningful together." He continued, highlighting specific programs that had made a difference. The after-school tutoring that had helped dozens of children improve their grades, the job training workshops that had led to employment opportunities, and the community health initiatives inspired by Mrs. Harrison's journey. "None of this would have been possible without every person in this room," Jamal said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "From the business owners who believed in our vision, to the volunteers who give their time every week, to the families who trust us with their children's futures, you are all part of this success." The audience listened intently as Jamal outlined the initiative's expansion plans: new educational programs, additional job training courses, and increased support for families facing medical challenges. Each announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. As Jamal concluded his speech, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. The Harrisons made their way to the stage, enveloping him in a warm embrace. Mrs. Harrison wiped happy tears from her eyes as Mr. Harrison's hand rested proudly on Jamal's shoulder. Looking out over the crowd of smiling faces, his old neighbors from the slum, his new neighbors from the suburbs, business partners, volunteers, and program participants, Jamal felt a deep sense of purpose. The community's energy and support filled the room with hope and possibility. If you enjoyed the story of Jamal, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.